So let's talk about identifiers in your APIs. As we saw in the last short video, we'd like to be able to know how to retrieve each of the individual parts of the data structures we're returning. And one approach here, and the approach that I advocate, is that each of the sorts of objects that you're returning here should be able to tell about its URL, a URL that points to this item on your server. And so this is something we're going to want to add to the model classes that are returned. You might say, well, why don't we just return the IDs and then document it well enough for them to know that nutrition foods/ID is what you need to do here. That's certainly valid, but I find it more descriptive to use an entire URL, especially as the nature of the paths might get changed, especially in versioning. You want the URL to be specific where it is on the server. So let's do that. If we go down to the models, let's start with the food model and go ahead and create a new property called URL. And I'm going to do the same thing to the measure model because we want that to be available in both cases. So we really want the magic here to happen when we use the model factory. So let's open up that model factory and figure out how we want to do this. We now have the create method that knows how to create an individual food model. We could certainly go ahead and just do a string.format and then just pass in the food.id. And this certainly will work. Let's give this just an empty string for now. We'll come back and do this. And if we build this, we can actually see the URL show up here as part of the description. I like to make sure it's first, but it's not super important that it's first as long as it's available. The problem with just using string concatenation here we see right away, and that is localhost, right? Suddenly the model factory is going to have to know about how this is being served, whether it's being served in IIS as part of testing for the developer, or maybe it's in a staging or testing or production server. It's going to have some knowledge of how to figure that out. And there's a way we could write the code to do that. The other problem is that if we change our routes, if we come in here later and decide during the process that instead of nutrition that we wanted to call it something else, we're going to have to go find all the instances of the code where that belongs. What would be nice is if we could actually ask Web API to construct the URL based on what it knows about the routes. In fact, that's exactly what you can do. So inside the model factory, I'm going to create a new constructor, and I want to create something called an URL helper. Now, when you use the URL helper, there's going to be one for ASP.NET MVC and one for Web API. Make sure you get the one from Web API, which is in system.web.http.routing. It can get very confusing, especially the kinds of error message you're going to get if you're trying to use the wrong URL helper. Now, the URL helper, even though it has an empty constructor, actually requires the request that is being used for the individual call. It's using this request to discern some information about how to get back to the routes. The problem is the model factory doesn't have access to that. And this requirement of having the request is one of the reasons why using something like AutoMapper falls apart, because we have to have a way during the construction of our controller to feed this into our model factory so that we can use it here in our helper. And the trick here is to actually pass in an HTTP request message, which is the object it's expecting. Let's bring in that namespace and refactor this to add the field. Once we have the URL helper, it becomes much easier because what we can do is say URL helper.link. This is much like action links in ASP.NET MVC. We're going to give it, in this case, a route name, which is food, and then an anonymous object that contains any of the route elements. And in this case, this is just going to be food ID equals food.id. So we're constructing an object that has all of the parts of the API that are required and letting the URL helper determine what the URI actually looks like. We need to capitalize that since it's capitalized in the food object. And I'll go ahead and do the same down here where we can say measures, which is what we call that route. And here the food ID will actually be measure.food.id, comma, ID equals measure.id. So now we have the model factory actually creating those URL links for us. Great. We do have the problem though. We need to be able to pass in this request now. If we go ahead and build, it's going to complain that we need to be able to construct the model factory in both of our controllers. We can't do it here because even if we do say this.request, this request at the time of the construction of the controller is empty because we're right here in the constructor, of course. So what we really need to do is defer the creation of this model factory. And so a pattern for simplifying some of this code, because we're going to be using the model factory and probably the repository in a great many of our controllers, is let's go ahead and create a base controller that we can move some of this common code to. So I'm going to create a new controller class, but this time I'm going to call it base controller. And all of our other controllers are going to be, not surprisingly, based on this class. I'm going to mark it as abstract so no one actually instantiates an instance of base controller. We're only going to be inheriting from it so we can have some of this shared functionality. So let's do a little editor inheritance here. And I'm going to copy the properties from the foods controller and the actual constructor over to my base controller. And I'll need to fix up some namespace inclusions. And of course, this is going to be base controller. We're also not going to want to create the model factory here in the constructor because it's too early. We actually want to defer it until we're actually going to use the model factory. And so a trick there is to just create a deferred property. So I'm going to say protected model factory, the model factory. You can call it whatever you want. This is just a pattern of naming things that I've gotten used to. And we're just going to say if the model factory is null, in other words, we have not created an instance yet, go ahead and create model factory equals new model factory this.request. Most likely the first person in that needs the model factory is going to be inside of one of these methods, and so this should be late enough for the request not to be null in this case. And we'll go ahead and return the model factory. The second person that needs the model factory, this won't be null anymore. It'll just go ahead and return the same instance over and over and over again. We should go ahead and also expose as a protected member the repository. In this case, we don't need to worry about deferring creation. We can just say return the repository. Now I could have made these protected and just given access to them, but I've gotten used to always using properties when communicating in between, so that way I can intercept. If later I need to defer the creation of the repository, I don't then have to refactor a bunch of code to do this. I already have this get being called. I can just expand the amount of code that's in this get call. So let's go fix up the two controllers. In these cases, we don't need the members anymore, but we still need to expect that the repository is going to be passed to us. But instead of us doing anything with them, we're just going to call the base class with the repository to do the right thing. We will need to change our base controller name, and I misnamed it. I like to call it base API controller so we know that it's the base controller for the API controllers, not for any other controllers in our project. And in fact, to be clear and concise, I'll go ahead and change the file name as well. So again, our foods controller now derives from base API controller, which then derives from API controller. So we're just creating a class shim in between the two. And when we ask for the repository, we're just passing it down to the base class because that's really where that's going to be stored. Does mean that all our instances of repo will now need to be the repository. Hope I spelled that right. And same with model factory. And I'll quickly do the same thing for measures, though I won't make you watch me. Glad you're back. Now we have both the measures controller refactored as well as the foods controller. And this means that because we're creating our model factory with a valid request, these URLs should go ahead and produce links for each of our objects for us. And with luck, we're now creating these based on the Web API routes themselves. So instead of having to know that this ID is actually 1 or 2, we just know that this is the URL that we'll retrieve, or later on when we do read and write entities, ones that we could post to or put to or delete to or patch to. In fact, if we just click over, we can see that this is going to take us directly to that individual measure or to that individual food. And even the whole collection of foods now is going to include that URL for each of those different entities that are going to be included in the results that our users are then going to use. At this point, we have the API done for foods and measures because all we're doing is allowing read-only access into the food and measure database, essentially. Now we want to move over to the user-specific API, and let's go ahead and implement that next.